Hey, Zach.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How you doing?
Good.
Have you heard anything from Moda?
I am not, no.
So I think I've gotten a few people to apply. It would be very cool to get the next get the next tranche of folks. Is Catherine Boucret, is she still the kind of the person?
She is, yes.
Okay.
Also, did you get the agenda?
I did. Thank you
Okay.
for sending that. Hello, welcome, Kevin, Santiago.
Ooh.
Hello, hello. We are just waiting for a few folks, but so Buddy will be joining. Let me try giving Helen a call as well. We would love to, so actually, Kevin, now that you're here, welcome. I think one of the things that we mentioned in our testimony a while ago was that we've been having some trouble getting Moda to kind of follow through on their follow through on the applications that we've been pushing their way. So we're kind of stuck. So it would be phenomenal if you could, if there was something that you guys could nudge on your end.
Yeah, if you want to send me the vacancies by
Yeah.
like category or something like that, we can either, I'll do like an informal email with the deadline, and then maybe we can escalate to like a formal oversight letter if it takes too long after that.
That sounds great. That sounds great. We are just waiting for we are waiting for a bunch of people. But I think we can probably me just text Helen. Yeah, I was just telling Zach, like we've gotten a few folks to apply. I think they've got 5 applications. We've got this is a small council. There's 6 total, but we have 3 vacancies right now. So it would be really, really good to get some folks to fill in. And kind of one of the 3 that is on the council has had some difficulty joining. So let me just text Helen. Yeah, I think we should probably just go ahead and get started. I'm just gonna also email Buddy. Yeah, I think we should go ahead and get started. So I will call the meeting to order. Unfortunately, we don't have quorum, but I think we've got a good group here. So I'm Karthik Balasubramanian, the chair of the MAAC, and professor at Howard University in Information Systems, just very interested in making DC less hostile to folks with disabilities. I have an eye condition called Stargardt's macular degeneration, which makes me not able to drive, but very much able to take the bus, bike and walk, basically, and just not use a car. And given that such a huge chunk of people who live in DC don't use a car, this is something especially folks with disabilities are twice as likely to not own a car or live in 0-car households. It's especially important for me and to the group to make sure that our transit system or kind of transportation network in general is welcoming to folks with all abilities. So that's me, and maybe we can just kind of popcorn around. So I'll pass it over to Zach, and then if you can pass it over to other folks, that'd be great.
Hey, good evening, everyone. This is Zach Smith. I am the Equity and Accessibility Analyst at the District Department of Transportation, also liaison to the MAAC, and I will pass it to Santiago.
Hi, I'm Santiago Lakotos. I'm an ANC Commissioner in Ward 1, 1B04, and I'm here to present about bus shelters, and I'll pass it to Kelly.
Hi there, Kelly Mack, and I'm a community member, DC resident with a disability, and I use a wheelchair for mobility.
Thanks, Kelly. And let's pass it to Kevin. I think you're the last person.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Whitfield. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for the DC Council's Committee on Transportation and the Environment. DDOT is the main agency in my portfolio, so that's sort of my connection with this work.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kevin. So why don't we kick off? So I know we've got presentations lined up from both Santiago and Kevin, but maybe if Kevin, if you're okay with it, maybe we can lead off with Santiago. Perfect. So Santiago, take it away.
All right, give me one moment to just make sure I have my PowerPoint started. Alrighty, can you see my presentation? All right, great. So as I said before, my name is Santiago Lakotos. I'm an ANC Commissioner in Ward 1. My district is just north of the U Street corridor. I'm also a very passionate advocate for bus riders as a lifelong bus rider. And I obviously will start this presentation. Basic caveat: I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the entire ANC. And get rolling. So here we go. Sorry, wrong slide. All right. So there are approximately 3,000 bus stops in the district, with around 711 shelters. As you can see in this picture here, most of you are familiar with this if you've ever ridden the bus. This is a bus shelter on 16th Street, 16th and U. It's got the glass backing, the cover, the bench, which isn't that really comfortable. And I think a lot of us, okay, maybe some of us in this conversation are a bit more in the weeds and have that understanding, but instinctively, from my conversations, people tend to think that bus shelters are actually managed by Metro, by WMATA, or sometimes to an extent DDOT, but when actually, in fact, bus shelters in the district are managed by Clear Channel Communications, or Clear Channel Outdoor, which is an outdoor advertising company, on behalf of DDOT as a part of their bus shelter franchise agreement. And so under that agreement, which was approved in 2005, and I'm going to talk about in more detail in the presentation, Clear Channel is responsible for the installation, maintenance, and management of up to a maximum of 788 bus shelters. So in exchange for the exclusive right to advertise on those bus shelters, in which they also share ad revenue with DDOT. But I'm going to get into those kind of specifics a little later. Now, currently, bus shelters are predominantly placed along, understandably, major bus corridors, albeit with proportionally more in Northwest, including downtown, but also the Connecticut Avenue corridor, 16th Street corridor, 14th Street corridor. And this map here is from Open Data. And while it's not fully complete, it's a pretty solid example of how the distribution plays out for buses across the district. And I know in many ways, as the saying goes, the map of DC is the same, no matter what you overlay on it, whether it's poverty, gun violence, pollution, race, or in this case, bus shelter placement, the inequities run pretty deep. And I think you can think about the inequity in terms of, at least in this example, in terms of bus lines. Sort of why does the D2, which runs on Connecticut Avenue, have better facilities in terms of bus shelters than the V2 on Minnesota Avenue, which also, by the way, has triple the ridership and far higher rates of bus dependency. So bus shelters are least present in the areas of the district with the lowest income, lowest car ownership rates, highest bus dependency, and highest percentage of Black population. And as I'm going to get into in the next slide, having bus shelters installed at bus stops isn't just a nice amenity to have, but it's also really a big matter of health. So those same inequities in bus shelter placement that kind of we saw on the last map also present themselves in how certain areas of the city are more affected by extreme heat and the urban heat island effect than others. There have been a lot of really hot days this summer. I think we've all noticed the difference from when we were walking under a nice, shady area or in a park, or maybe sometimes the other week I went to Rock Creek Park when it was very hot and it was a lot cooler. And then I came back to U Street and it was far hotter. It's just an anecdotal example, but there's a direct link between a lack of bus shelters and higher exposure to the very dangerous health effects of extreme heat. Shade, including from bus shelters, can save your life when you're waiting outside for 30 minutes for a bus or longer. We all know how it goes sometimes. It says it's going to come in 10 minutes, it comes in 30. That's a structural problem with the way that transit runs. But if someone's stuck out there feeling the brunt of the heat, it can really affect you. And because extreme heat is so dangerous, especially dangerous to people who are elderly, those with health conditions, many of which also occur at higher rates in those bus dependent communities due to we kind of string along the effects of pollution, disinvestment, lack of healthcare. So I don't want to rabbit hole us, but I think you kind of get the broader picture, which is all these things are interconnected. And it's also why shelters themselves are so important for both, the present, dignity for bus riders and the health needs we already have, but also the future of our transit system and building up climate resiliency, because the hot days we're having in the summer now are just going to continue to become more and more and more frequent. And there are broader effects going on, efforts going on in the district government to combat the urban heat island effect, extreme heat, working on climate change. The Department of Energy and the Environment has been very proactive about that. But at the end of the day, unlike transit riders who can go into the metro stations, who usually have the cooling systems running, or get into a car that has air conditioning, bus riders are pretty much always forced to wait in the elements. And when they're waiting in the elements without even shade or protection, and minimal protection from a bus shelter, it gets even worse. And I think the health effects are pretty clear, but in addition to that, having sufficient bus shelter installations is also, as I kind of alluded to before, a matter of equity, dignity, and then if we want to talk broadly about improving and attracting riders to the bus system, it's a big incentive. So I've been riding the bus since before I can remember. So I was a little kid, and pretty much from then to now, in Los Angeles where I grew up to DC where I live now, bus riders almost always get the short end of the stick. That tide is changing. The district is making significant investments in bus priority infrastructure, 24/7 bus lines, a redesigned bus network, a lot of really great stuff. But at the same time, there's still the lack of shelters across the district is just another sign, at least in my opinion, of sort of institutional lack of respect that for bus riders. We talk about equity when it comes to health, but it's also important to remember equity about bus riders in general. 80% of bus riders are people of color. 68% have a household income below 50,000. Bus riders are far more likely to live in a household that doesn't have a car. And bus ridership bounced back much faster than rail ridership and never dipped as much in the pandemic, because essential workers, people who have to be in person, are the people who are most likely who have to ride a bus. And those riders deserve investments across the board, and not just in terms of what we're doing on bus priority now, which is great, but also shelter to provide basic protection from the elements while they wait for their bus. And I kind of, as I alluded to before, in addition to existing riders, studies have shown that creating a better experience for potential riders, including adding bus shelters, has been shown to convince skeptical individuals into riding the bus. I think those are the people we most want to try and attract out of cars and into the bus, because at the end of the day, the bus is designed to get you around town, while Metro Rail is designed to bring commuters in from the suburbs, albeit with other purposes, so oversimplification. Moving on. But I talked a lot about all this, but pretty fast run through all these kind of different aspects of where we are right now. But I think an important question for this group to understand and to kind of address is, why are we currently in this situation? Why are there so few bus shelters? Why are they not where we need them the most? And I would argue that the existing bus shelter franchise agreement is the primary driving point that has caused the situation. So this agreement, which was signed by the district in 2005, first of all, sets the maximum number of bus shelters that this company will provide at 788. As we talked about before, there's over 3,000 bus stops in the district, and that's around a maximum of, that means that around a maximum of 25% of them at any time could have a bus shelter on them. And that's not, it's not gonna be more surprising as we go through some more of the details, but the current agreement, which by the way expires in 2 years, is designed in sort of an antiquated way that treats bus shelters primarily as a means of extracting advertising revenue for the general fund, rather than a piece of social infrastructure, which shelters fundamentally are. And because of this, there isn't a way that you could put in a 311 request for a bus shelter, and then you could work with people at DDOT, and the same way you could request flex posts or daylighting an intersection or AT camera or something of the sort. And even there's been a few bus priority projects where they aren't able to actually get new shelters, partly because of the agreement and partly because of some ongoing litigation. But I will also add a caveat, though, that the agreement itself doesn't actually prohibit DDOT from installing shelters. It just prohibits DDOT from installing shelters that have advertising. So it's an exclusive agreement for control of advertising. So if DDOT, for example, wanted to put up their own shelters, start their own system, but just not put ads on them, they would be able to. I'm not a lawyer, but I've read the agreement at least 5 times to make sure I wasn't kind of misreading this. But another holdup is ongoing litigation between Clear Channel and DDOT, which makes this whole situation further complicated. I can't solve this litigation, and understandably, DDOT can't talk about it. I think this was a subject of the performance oversight hearing. But to sum it up, for those of you, Clear Channel is suing DDOT over a dispute about how much minimum ad revenue Clear Channel had to send DDOT during the pandemic when advertising revenues were down. And honestly, the litigation itself, I think, is just another sign of how the agreement and this specific sort of revenue-focused approach to bus shelters is really fundamentally flawed. If you think about it, an advertising company has basically paralyzed our ability to and willingness to build new pieces of infrastructure that we need now, because that agreement prioritizes generating revenue over social infrastructure. But despite all of that, I think there's a lot of really great opportunities to make a change. That franchise agreement is up for renewal in 2 years. I don't work for DDOT, so I don't know how litigation will affect that renewal process. But I think the franchise agreement needs a general rethink. Bus shelters should not be viewed primarily as revenue generators, but primarily as social infrastructure. But there's also no reason that we can't still gain or capture some sort of revenue. There's a lot of other models of franchise agreements that I would argue work better. In 2019, Montgomery County signed their franchise agreement, which puts the county in charge and responsible for installing new shelters, while the franchisee manages advertisement, shares the revenue, and manages maintenance. So they're still able to spread out and install new shelters, but they're at the same time they're not adding on an extra enhanced burden from having to handle all that maintenance, which I know can be a challenge. And nothing's free, but bus shelters aren't. This isn't the K Street Transit Way or like the Blue Line Loop. I think in a meeting recently with another DDOT representative, they gave a ballpark estimate for if we wanted to have like the best bus shelter around like 30,000 per. We could have a broader conversation about where we can get that money from. But there's already money actually dedicated to this type of infrastructure. The Bus Service Enhancement Fund in Metro Free DC, which includes revenue for improving bus infrastructure and specifically mentions bus shelters. That funding is currently being dedicated towards the 24/7 bus lines, which I think is a great idea. But I think there's a conversation to be had in the next budget cycle as we kind of move forward about how that fund can be enhanced and how that money can also be spent on improving the basics of infrastructure like shelters. For example, the Clear Lanes program is going to be bringing a fair amount of revenue. And I think this is something we kind of just have to maybe start thinking about probably. But I threw a lot of information at you all. Thank you for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, and just to kind of frame, so thanks so much, Santiago. This is fantastic. This kind of dovetails really well with our conversation about transportation inequities, specifically kind of focused on folks with disabilities who are, again, twice as likely to not own a car. So even more important that the bus works well, efficiently, and reliably, and kind of the experience before, during, and after riding the bus is one that is, as Santiago mentioned, is one that's kind of efficient for folks and also, has dignity. For so many of our bus stops, I think about 2,300 of them are exposed to the elements, and this is something that we definitely want to highlight. The scale of the problem is about kind of from that same conversation, it's about a $30 million problem. So 30K per shelter, and about 1,000 of those bus shelters can have shelters without kind of complications like kind of moving curbs or ADA, kind of other things. So this is kind of definitely something that, again, like, we can fix this problem. There's some complications with contracting, but this is something that can and should be fixed. And this dovetails nicely with our work. We're working on a transportation and equity scorecard. So I just dropped a link in the chat. This is very much a work in progress, but basically kind of highlighting, we're looking to highlight kind of where the district is falling short on delivering kind of true equity in the transportation realm, especially for folks with disabilities. So kind of we're tracking, between 14 and 16 metrics right now. We're hoping to, as I mentioned, this is a draft, but this is something that I can definitely imagine adding the percentage of bus shelters or percentage of bus stops with a bus shelter in place, and that being a metric that we track is, I think, will be very, very useful. But yeah, thanks so much, Santiago. This is fantastic. I'll open it up for questions for Santiago.
Santiago, is your understanding that Clear Channel has complete authority right now to dictate the location of the shelters that they agreed to install under the franchise agreement?
I'm not sure. I think that's my understanding is that I'd have to double check, but I believe there's a specific, the only required locations in the agreement are that they replace the bus stops, the bus shelters that were there before they became the franchisee. But I don't know how, this is also something that's kind of up in the air. I don't know how they're managing them now because they're in this sort of like, we're in the state of limbo. And I've heard from, this doesn't happen in my area, but also in, I think this was somewhere on Benning Road, like a couple of shelters were removed. I said a FOIA and I asked around at DDOT, and there was no records of those shelters being removed, but they're not there. They were they're there one day and they're gone. And I don't know if Clear Channel did that, but I don't know where that current relationship is at now that we're in this sort of, challenging, difficult state where it's hard to talk about it, in public meetings.
Thank you.
Or any other questions for Santiago? This is kind of fantastic, and I we'll definitely plug this into our scorecard data requests, kind of looking to track this. Yes, Kelly, fantastic. Any other kind of final questions, comments before we turn it over to Kevin to talk about recent legislation that will hopefully allow us to be more proactive in taking dangerous drivers off the road, among other things. Great. Yeah. Why don't we then turn it over to Kevin? Kevin, it's all yours. It may be just me, but I can't.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
We can.
great. So I'm here to talk about a bill that Councilmember Allen introduced a few weeks ago called the Strengthening Traffic Enforcement Education and Responsibility Amendment Act of 2023. This bill was introduced mostly as a follow-up to our traffic enforcement hearing that we held a few months ago. And I'm sure most folks here are familiar, but kind of the high level issue that we're trying to solve is one, we have on the one hand rising traffic deaths, even as we've committed ourselves to Vision Zero and completely eliminating them, where they basically will increase significantly from 2015 when we initially announced the goal. I think we're on track now to hit basically a 20-year high of traffic fatalities. So we're not making sufficient progress towards that goal, despite lots of traffic safety improvements taking here and there. And I think one of the biggest issues is that we have lots of dangerous drivers from both DC and Maryland and Virginia. So right now, I think the total stands, at least as a couple months ago, is that there are 6.2 million outstanding traffic tickets that total about $1.3 billion. So you could easily solve that $1 million problem that Karthik was talking about a few moments ago, and that Santiago was talking about, if we just were collecting money better. So the bill is kind of a broad set of policy changes that we hope would improve traffic safety by creating a little bit more accountability for drivers and trying to do so in a way that I think addresses some of the equity concerns that have stymied traffic safety improvements or other policies up till now. So I'll kind of walk through some of the high level things that the bill does, and I'm happy to delve into sort of like more specific information or answer any questions you all have. And I should say there are two other bills related to traffic safety that I can't speak to as fluently. One was introduced by Councilmember Nadeau and is largely centered around the issue of fake tags. And then one was introduced by Councilmember Henderson and is largely centered around beefing up the automated traffic enforcement system by having cameras that capture drivers so you can assess points against them and things like that. But on the Strengthening Traffic Enforcement Education Responsibility Act, or STEER, one of the first things it does is it creates a parallel system of enforcement related to speeding and other traffic safety violations. So right now, the rule is DPW can immobilize your car, so that's installing a boot, or tow and impound it to a facility if you have 2 or more outstanding tickets, which basically means that as long as you keep up with your fines and fees, you are free to speed as long as possible. There's nothing stopping you from just getting back behind the wheel of a car after speeding, as long as you can pay. And so there's sort of this idea that you can buy your way into dangerous driving. What our bill does is it creates a parallel system. So we still keep that 2 outstanding fines rule, but we also then create a system based on the accumulation of tickets over a 6-month period of time. So the thresholds we establish are if you get 8 tickets for speeding at 10 or less miles above the speed limit, if you get 6 tickets speeding 11 miles over, 2 tickets for reckless driving, which is 20 miles per hour over, or 1 ticket for aggravated reckless driving, that's 30 miles per hour over. This the DC can also boot your car or tow and impound your car, regardless of whether or not you keep those fines and fees. And the idea being that if you're accumulating that many traffic tickets over that short of a window, you're really a dangerous driver that just ought to have the driving privileges taken away for a period of time. The next issue that we solve is this issue of reciprocity. So right now, generally speaking, there is something called the driver's license compact, and most states through that honor the driving record determinations of another state. So if, for example, you rack a bunch of other speeding tickets in North Carolina and you try to apply for a license in South Carolina will suspend your license or refuse to grant you one based off of the tickets in North Carolina. And they'll also just modify your driving privileges. So, if you can't drive in North Carolina, you won't be able to drive in Tennessee. It's kind of the general rule. It's not a federal law. It's really just a state by state law that states passed, I think, in like the late 1970s. The problem is that in Maryland and Virginia, they basically abandoned enforcing their driver's license compact, which is why 90% of those tickets that I mentioned earlier are from Maryland or Virginia. Just an overwhelming number of outstanding tickets from those jurisdictions. There is a few years ago, the council granted the mayor the authority to negotiate reciprocity very explicitly and issue a report afterwards to update us on the progress. And basically, Maryland and Virginia said no. There's just no political will. If you think that you're a governor running for one of those states, there's not a huge constituency that says, yes, we want to be responsible for paying our fines in the district. Plus, there's sort of a unfortunate political turn in the last couple of years where those states try to use DC as sort of a punching bag or a foil. And so I think this issue is just kind of dead in the water when it comes to a political compromise across the states. So what the bill would do instead is take advantage of a provision in the Constitution called the Full Faith and Credit Clause, which requires that court judgments from state to state be honored. And so what the bill would do is it would give the Office of the Attorney General the ability to issue or to civilly sue dangerous drivers or their motor vehicles directly in civil court in DC. And once the Office of Attorney General attains a judgment against those drivers or their cars, the courts in that driver's home state have no choice but to honor that judgment. And I say their cars directly. What I mean by that is there's actually a civil action called an action in rem where you can sue property. This is often used in civil asset forfeiture. So you'll see things like United States versus briefcase with $100,000, or the state of Wisconsin against 2012 Lexus or whatever. And the idea is that if for some reason OAG decides that it's actually better to just pursue an action against the property itself, they could do that. And that would have the upside of not having sort of collateral consequences against the driver. So, if they're applying for a job or they're applying for the bar or some other occupational license, they wouldn't have to disclose a civil suit against them. The other thing the bill does is it would create a safe driving course that drivers have to complete prior to the reinstatement of their driving privileges. So if, for example, they get their license suspended because of outstanding fines and fees, or they get their driver's license suspended because of the accumulation of traffic tickets over that 6-month window, they would have to take the safe driving course in order to get their license reinstated. To address some of the equity concerns about low-income people having sort of a disproportionate burden when it comes to paying fines, we also say that the DMV can use participation in this course to waive fees at the rate of $100 per hour participation. Which we think is kind of a pretty generous rule. If someone's making minimum wage at $15 an hour, they would have to work, roughly 8 hours to satisfy that fine, or they can just take a safe driving course to also mitigate the fine that way. It's an hour of their time. It's sort of extracting a little bit of a penalty from them to do that. But the idea is that you wouldn't have this huge barrier financially to maintaining your driving privileges that sort of a more wealthy person could just kind of brush off more easily. And finally, the bill strengthens the district's response to driving under impairment offenses in a couple of different ways. Right now, the rule is if you have 3 drivers, So what the bill would change is upon any charge of negligent vehicular homicide, which covers a couple of different offenses, including murder and sort of manslaughter as well, you would have your license suspended during the pendency of that case. It also would require that you lose your driving privileges after the accumulation of DUI offenses over a 5-year window, although I think we're probably going to even lower that threshold even further, just because right now there's quite a bit of leeway to how many driving under the influence offenses you can rack up before you have your license suspended. And then the other issue is during our hearing, we discovered that the DMV is not really getting accurate, the DMV was not properly receiving data from DC Superior Court when it came to driving under impairment convictions, which meant that the DMV wasn't actually suspending the licenses for people who've been convicted of DUIs. That was something that came to light during the investigation after the Rock Creek Park crash, where a driver killed an Uber driver and 2 of their passengers. And so what the bill would do is it would require that the DMV send monthly reports to the court and to the OAG, listing the licenses they have suspended pursuant to court order. And it would allow and then the DMV would then send the committee a report every 6 months listing the number of suspensions that they've enacted pursuant to a court order, providing another layer of oversight. And I should clarify what I mean to say about the 3 DUI offenses is that right now, when you get your 3rd DUI offense within 5 years, it is a purely administrative requirement that the DMV suspend your license. But there's no requirement that the court actually issue an order. And we think that if you require the court to issue an order to the DMV, there's way less chance that that order be sort of ignored, as opposed to them just sort of failing to follow the paperwork trail of suspending licenses. So what we're doing is we're asking that the court directly order the DMV to then suspend the licenses after 3 DUIs within 5 years. And again, I think during the markup, we'll probably reconsider whether or not 3 years is kind of too high a threshold before you lose driving privileges after a DUI. So that's kind of a basic overview of the bill. Happy to answer any questions you all have. And I think in terms of process, what we'll probably do is we'll probably mark or have a hearing on the bill pretty soon after the council comes back after summer recess. I'm thinking either late September or very early October. And I wouldn't be surprised if we get this bill marked up prior to December. So with that, happy to turn it over to any questions.
I've got some questions, but would love to kind of have folks chime in first. I mean, I think general sense is this is kind of fantastic movement on kind of where we need to get the worst drivers off the road. But yeah, oh, I think I see a hand. Who I don't actually see who it is. If you've got a hand, go
It's
for it. Go for it.
Kelly.
Yeah, go for it, Kelly.
Thanks, Karthik. Yeah, I had a question about drivers who injure a person, not kill them, and you know that can be very serious too. And how can we maybe get those drivers some help or off the road?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually forgot this component of the bill. We amend the definitions of reckless and aggravated reckless driving to be a little bit clearer. So right now, reckless driving in DC is kind of a nebulous standard. It's just basically driving recklessly is the offense of reckless driving. We create a brighter line for that, which is 20 miles per hour over the speed limit. So either you can, an officer could observe someone swerving in a way that is super reckless or operating at high speeds that they don't clock, or, I don't know, drinking a beer while talking on their phone while blindfolded or something like that. That would be reckless driving. But they could also just say, listen, we clocked you at 20 miles per hour, either visually or through the ATE system, and that would also constitute reckless driving. We then also do the same thing for aggravated reckless driving, which is it's currently set at 30 miles per hour or 20 miles per hour plus some bad consequence, which includes causing property damage, or I want to say the current rule is colliding with another motor vehicle. We streamline it a little bit so that it's like also either striking another person or a roadway user directly as well. That would be aggravated reckless driving if it's happening, I guess, at 20 miles per hour over the speed limit. But I think there's a couple other offenses existing in the DC code that would capture collisions with a pedestrian, another car, bicyclist, etc.
Thanks. That's helpful, because a lot of what I've seen is drivers getting close to or hitting someone who's crossing under a walkway light, and so I think catching those issues would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's I think there's probably a lot of thought into maybe adding that as its own separate standard for the license suspension along with the accumulation of offenses. So yeah, that's something certainly we could think about as well.
Thank you.
Any other folks? I mean, again, this is a great opportunity to give some feedback to Kevin and kind of their driving this stuff forward. So yeah, this is a great opportunity to share your views. Okay, well, I've given appropriate.
I think Santiago just raised his hand, actually.
Oh, go for it. Santiago, go for it.
I just had a quick question. I'm not super familiar with the legislation besides kind of the description you gave. Does it address the issue of like fake or improperly issued temporary tags in any way? Because I know we have, like, I've seen some of these cars where it's like there's 3 different cars that have the same fake temp tag because they downloaded off Google Images or something like that, or they bought it from someone on Instagram. Does it give like the OAG any power to address that, or something like that? I don't know.
Yeah, so we had removed that portion of the bill because we knew Councilmember Nadeau was releasing a similar bill that was covering that topic. So just to be deferential to her, we pulled that out. My understanding, I'll tell you where I'm leaning going, just even regardless of what her legislation says, is 1, temporary tags would also be a basis for, or excuse me, not temporary, illicit tags. So either fake temporary or even fake permanent. Fake permanent tags is actually this weird gap in the law that's not addressed. You can have a fake temporary tag and that creates some consequences, but if you have a fake permanent tag, it's somehow excluded from that rule for reasons that are not known to me. But I would say that along with the speeding offenses I mentioned, 1 single offense of having a illicit tag would also be a basis for losing driving privileges, regardless of whether or not the fine is satisfied. And that's because there's just really no reason to do that other than if you're planning on breaking the law and want to have sort of a consequence-free way of avoiding like the ATE system or other issues. So yes, we will, I think, absolutely make a fake tag a basis for immobilizing your vehicle or losing your driving privileges.
And a brief kind of follow up to that, because that's good to know. I had forgotten about Councilmember Nadeau's bill. Does the current law, or well, I guess I'm not sure if you're how familiar you are with her bill or your bill addresses this. Does it cover like obscuring or defacing like tags? Because I know this is a big problem in New York where people just like, and I've started to see them around here too. The ones where like, they put something over a couple of the letters, or they have like the reflector thing, stuff like that.
I'm open to it. I had a question from a constituent who had read the bill that was on a similar nature. And I would say what I obscured is kind of a tougher word choice, just because I don't want, like, let's say, for example, someone who has a license plate cover that's like yellowed naturally over time to be the basis of losing your driving privileges. So I think absent some sort of carve out for those use cases where it's really more like negligence in terms of maintaining your vehicle as opposed to like this really intentional effort to deceive law enforcement. I'd be open to covering sort of those obscured tags too, but I think it's just crafting that rule in a way that really captures the like intentional scofflaws, as opposed to someone who like ran through a mud puddle and their car didn't get dinged or didn't get cleaned, and so now they're getting dinged for an obscured tag. But yeah, I think that's broadly speaking, sort of any effort to make your tag not able to be connected to your motor vehicle or your driving record is something we want to capture.
Yeah, and to be clear, so I just want to make sure I wasn't necessarily, and I didn't clarify this in my question. I was just asking, is that currently against the law? Like, not about like taking away license, but like, I'm like, can DPW give someone a ticket for that, or like MPD? Like, I don't know if that's currently against the law. So.
I think that's handled by a DC municipal reg. There is an actual like DC code offense for having an obscured, having an illicitly or like a fraudulent temporary tag. There is that weird gap in the law when I mentioned like a fake temporary tag would somehow not trigger that same thing. But I think there's just within the DCMR, there's a rule that you have to have, a valid driver's license on you, a validly issued tag that's visible and things like that. And so, but my sense is that it doesn't rise to the level of a criminal violation. It's actually more like a civil offense or like an infraction.
All right, cool. Because I think that's something that I've heard from, and I'll stop hogging the mic, but sort of when I've filed 311 requests for people who have like someone who put like cardboard in front of their license plate, and like DPW came and said like they couldn't give a ticket because it was blocked, and so I might have just been the parking enforcement officer, but then it kind of got a bit conflicting responses about that. But it's just I'm sure it's on your radar, so I just want to flag that.
I'm going to try to in the background also look for that fraudulent tag statute, just so I can drop that in the chat. And I've also dropped a link to the bill itself. That's my message at 6:11 p.m. Zach, I think you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. This question is from Heather Foote. She asked about the driving school model and what other states you looked at, because apparently it's a really big business in California, and it may not lead to the outcomes that you want to see. So I guess it's just about driving schools, and is that really a good sort of way to have people improve their driving?
Haven't done much research into like what the curriculum would look like. I will say, one of the reasons why we really wanted to include some other way of satisfying fines other than monetary payment is because I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but I think it was just last year, Councilmember McDuffie moved an amendment to the Clean Hands Law. So that's basically a law saying you can't have any outstanding debt to the district if you want the district to issue a license. That could be a business license, that could be a driver's license, all sorts of things. It would have had the effect, or it did have the effect of meaning that you could, and he basically made some modifications that really lowered the application of the Clean Hands Law, which meant that if you had an outstanding fine or fee to the district because of a traffic ticket, you could still get your driver's license. Councilmember Allen, my boss moved an amendment along with, I want to say Councilmember Henderson and Councilmember Nadeau to create a narrow exception to that bill that would still say, if you have fines and fees that are related to a traffic offense, you cannot renew a driver's license. You can renew your business license. You can get a DCRA permit or whatever. You just can't get a driver's license again because you have tickets under record. That amendment was pretty soundly defeated. And so there is, I think in order for something like this to be sort of politically successful, I think there's just got to be an off ramp other than monetary payment for some of these offenses. And yeah, and so, you know, and again, we still have this parallel system where you, even if you do maintain your fines and fees, you still can get your license suspended based off of the accumulation of speeding tickets over a certain window of time. So we think, sort of, given that we're not completely replacing the fines and fees system, we want to be like sort of a little generous to the extent that someone else, you know, someone who's low income doesn't get a traffic ticket and can't drive their car in a way that someone who's super wealthy can. I think the other option that we considered at some point, is like income-based fines and fees are another way of addressing this issue. But I think from an administrability standpoint, it is just really hard to use an income-based model. Mostly, I think there's a federal rule saying you can't use tax documents for anything other than tax purposes. And so, like, what seemed to me like a really neat idea, which is to say, have the Office of Tax and Revenue turn over someone's AGI from the last year and have their AGI be the basis of their traffic ticket. It ends up being a lot harder to administer a rule like that. I think we want to be mindful that this isn't just like someone rolling out a projector and playing a video with no interaction, and that being a way of you satisfying your tickets, or that you hit play and then you just walk away from your computers, So I think the devil is in the details there, but I hear you that we can't just like sort of like mindlessly create this class without thinking about how it's actually impacting driver behavior.
Thanks.
So yeah, and actually, if other folks have questions, feel free to kind of jump in. But I'll start with some of my comments and questions. So income-based model is interesting, but I think vehicle value-based model, vehicle value fine-based model might be easier to administer and without some of the tax complications or kind of requiring tax documents, especially from Maryland, Virginia drivers, which is kind of even harder to get. All license plates are connected to a VIN, and that vehicle identification number, from that vehicle identification number, you can actually get the make, model number, or the make, model, and year of a car, and then you can port that into any number of services that will generate a value. The reason I like this particular model is that it actually addresses both sides. So right now, the fines are too punitive for folks who are low income. So a $100 fine or a $250 fine is very punitive for someone who's low income, and that's not great. But then on the other side, it's nowhere near punitive enough for folks who are driving kind of very expensive cars, so kind of the Ferraris, or the kind of people who are reckless and can just pay these tickets off. And vehicle value-based fines solve both of those issues in one go. So I wanted to kind of put in a plug for that to be looked at and be considered. On the obscured tag front, I kind of want to highlight the kind of Santiago's point here. This, at least anecdotally, I've been seeing a lot more of these. And once this behavior becomes normalized, that, you can completely skip out on all ATE fines by just putting a dark license plate cover over your over your car, like once that becomes normalized, then more and more people will have it, and more regular people will have it, and that completely will kill all of our all of the potential good things that happen when we introduce ATEs. The speeding decreases, the crashes decrease, etc. So I wanted to highlight those two things, and kind of wanted to see what you had to kind of your thoughts, Kevin.
Yeah, I think we'll probably be, I think, moving in terms of what we do for fines will probably be really deferential to the implementing agencies. And I should say also, like, it's not like we're going to pass this bill and say we did it, we're done. And so I think I've always been really fascinated by any sort of income-based metric or value-based metric for fines, just because it's a way more fair model for doing it. I think so. As long as sorry, I have dogs going crazy upstairs. Not sure how much you can catch that. So I'm open to it. I think it would really depend on what sort of DDOT or DMV says is easiest to do, or how that impacts the adjudication rates. And the other background is there is, parallel to the council writing these bills, the mayor has convened an ATE task force. That task force is really more focused on the automated traffic enforcement system rather than traffic enforcement writ large. But there's been a lot of discussion about how we can modify fines in a way that, one, feels fairer, but also lowers the number of cases that aren't paid promptly. So I think that's sort of one part of it. The other, on the issue of obscured and fake tags, I totally hear you. And I think I think part of that is going to be, catching obscured tags is not something that the AT enforcement is going to do. They'll capture them on camera, but they can't then pursue enforcement because they can't connect it to a driver's license. Sorry about that. So I think, I think I lost you.
Yep.
Oh, I'm back now. There we go.
Okay.
Kevin, are you still there? It looks like you're still connected. We just
Kevin.
can't hear you.
Yeah. I think we've got. Yeah, and it's also, you're not on mute, Kevin, which is good, but.
Now?
Oh, vaguely.
Slightly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so weird. I don't know if anything changed on my end. Okay.
There we go.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'll go off video. So what I was trying to say is, the issue of fake tags is, or obscured tags is tougher because it's a violation that isn't enforceable through the ATE system. And so the next question is, who are you empowering, or who are you charging with finding those obscure tags and then ticketing the individual driver? From my experience in recent years, there has not been a lot of appetite from MPD to do traffic enforcement. And there's also very fair considerations about what it would mean for that agency to beef up their enforcement in terms of what are the sort of the collateral consequences of these contacts with law enforcement. And so, I think one thought we've had is, do you create a sort of civilianized traffic enforcement system parallel to MPD to do that work? That will probably be larger than this bill in front of us, just because that has sort of huge sort of agency management implications in terms of either, are you empowering a new agency to do that? Are you empowering an existing agency to do that? But it's absolutely a big issue, and I think it's a fair one to raise. I think what we exactly do about that, other than creating a standalone offense and making sure that it's
a basis for revoking driving privileges or issuing a boot or an immobilization order. Beyond that, I think we'll have to that'll probably be the context of another bill.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we could do is, so I think right now DPW cannot enforce that statute, and PD can, but in practice doesn't, because my guess is they just don't want to. So I think one simple solution might be, or kind of simple, not catch all, but one thing that we could do is just empower DPW to start recognizing and just writing a ticket against a vehicle that that has, obviously obscured plates, and then making that vehicle tow eligible. I think that's like a pretty simple solution.
And yeah, and I should say there are already things that DPW is rolling out that will help them detect mostly their automated license plate readers that they put on buses. But I think DDOT is exploring some other camera placements that can help feed information to DPW in real time. And so I think that's, yeah, absolutely. One of the reasons why I don't want to over promote that is because DPW is absolutely at its capacity already when it comes to issuing the boot, either towing vehicles or booting them. So until we beef up that capacity further, you're sort of just adding more and more vehicles to an already impossibly long queue. And so I think sort of any enforcement strategy has to also include just getting more tow trucks out there and getting the coordination tighter.
Totally. And I think just, the statute could just allow them to just allow it to happen. Whether or not they have capacity is another thing. But just allow it to, like, allow DPW to write these tickets might be a good start. And then on the this is something that kind of we talked about, I'm not sure with whom, but augmenting the DPW capacity, tow truck or towing capacity with private towers. Both NPS and Secret Service use ANA towing, or it's a kind of private entity to tow vehicles out of DC. So there is precedent for it, and it's already happening. And actually, I think DPW, if you want to tow off of private property, DPW has to come write a ticket, and then you're free to call it a private tower. So that might be a good way. Obviously, you don't want to create like kind of a bounty system, but it is a kind of allowing for the private market to step in here and correct kind of this like really, really bad situation might be helpful.
Yeah, and I will say an earlier draft of our bill that spoke to more of like the DPW enforcement end that we took out just to allow Councilmember Joe to introduce her bill did exactly that. So I think it's fair to say that whatever package of bills emerge from our office will include the ability to contract with private tow companies to up the enforcement capacity. Yeah, as part of it, for sure.
Cool. I've got a few other questions, but before I ask them, I definitely want to make sure I'm not monopolizing conversation. So I'll kind of open up the space again. Anyone with other questions? Okay, cool. Well, I'll continue and feel free to, anyone else, if you've got a question, feel free to unmute yourself. So heavy trucks cause a disproportionate amount of death and injury. And I'm wondering, and because of that, I feel like, it might make sense to create a more strict system. So like, if you're driving a truck that is more dangerous, then the burden or your responsibility should be higher. So I wonder if there's anything that we can do to call out specifically or kind of create another kind of parallel system for points on CDLs or commercial driver's licenses, so that, like, hey, if you're speeding, if you're 10 miles and over on a truck, or if you run a red on a truck, that is that is very, 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 I mean, obviously running red or, speeding is very serious, but it's just, another level of seriousness when it's a truck. Is that something that's come up at all?
No, that's actually the first I've heard of that. We have, in terms of truck weight, I think I've read a lot of recent suggestions about tying registration fees to truck weights a little bit more aggressively, I guess. I think we've recently done a little bit to address vehicle registrations when it comes to weight, but I haven't heard sort of like the nexus of weight and speeding, although it makes perfect sense that like 5-ton truck presents a more serious public safety risk traveling at high speeds than a 2-ton truck will. I don't know how much, I think DDOT just recently updated a freight plan. I don't know how much that spoke to speeding with freight, but
It doesn't.
okay,
Yeah, I watched the video. It doesn't. So
so yeah, I would say that's something we'd be interested in exploring. I from the hearing on this bill, it's tough. I would say it may not, these other suggestions may not make it in this bill just because of how the process plays out, and that like we typically like to have for something super unique, like a bill in front of witnesses to testify on, just so that there can be a little bit more robust conversation about those provisions as opposed to things that are in the bill as introduced.
Yep.
But I can certainly flag for our team kind of like a desire or an appetite for exactly what you mentioned and see what we can do about it.
Cool, thanks. And then the last thing, and this is somewhat tied in, there's a DDOT truck that almost ran me over a couple weeks ago, and it's just like, wow, like if you're driving like that, it blew a stop sign, and I was in the crosswalk, and it's just like if you're driving like that in a work vehicle, like what are you doing in your private vehicle? And it got me thinking too. It's just like, again, kind of this um this level of responsibility. Like if you're being paid by the district to drive a district a DC fleet vehicle, like you really, really have, a real responsibility to drive safely. And I'm wondering if there's anything right now that um that forces agencies that do authorize vehicle usage or kind of DC fleet vehicle usage uh, by people or by employees. Are they checking against? Are they making sure that their people aren't racking up ATE violations, or kind of they're not in general driving dangerously? And I think, I don't know, maybe if this is standalone or this can dovetail with some of this kind of license suspension stuff, but we have a lot of DC fleet vehicles. We've got a lot of those vehicles, and it's just, I think there's something we can do. I think there's something that we might be able to do here that makes those vehicles hopefully be operated by safer drivers.
Yeah, so you should reach out to she's an ANC 6005 Commissioner Ashton Romer, raised this exact point with me, which is seeing some requirement that the DMV cross-reference DC municipal employee data to make sure that they're not either accruing tickets in their personal vehicles, but more specifically in government fleet vehicles. So yeah, I think that's also a suggestion well taken.
Cool. Those were my comments. This is, I mean, in general, my big picture comment here is this is like overwhelmingly a great thing for the district. I've loved that kind of there's so much focus on it right now, and I'm really excited to see what kind of what ends up coming out of the process. But all of these, I mean, yeah, I'm thrilled with this of just getting kind of the worst drivers off the road, and kind of re-educated on how to drive. And if you're not able to kind of drive responsibly, then you'll lose your car or you'll lose your license or both. And that's something that I think kind of is long overdue. So kind of, very, very much appreciate all of the hard work, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely. Santiago, I see you have your hand raised. So I'm happy to answer that question, and then I'll
Yeah, I don't want to keep you too long. I was gonna kind of going off of what Karthik just mentioned. I think in the last session, I believe former council member Silverman introduced a bill to install speed governors on district-owned vehicles. It's something New York City's actually doing, and I think it might be a good approach when we're thinking about this. I don't know how many crashes district-owned vehicles get into every year, but I would imagine that has an effect on our funds, since you might have to pay out settlements, you have to pay for the repair of vehicles. I don't know if the district insures their own vehicles or how that necessarily works, but I imagine if we did, that insurance costs more when you're getting more crashes. But it also, I think it has a sort of, what's it called, like a domino effect. So if you're driving a DPR truck on a street, the speed limit of the street is 25 miles an hour and you're going 25, the cars around you are gonna be forced by the fact that you're going the speed limit to then, actually act in that way, versus if you're able to go 40 miles an hour, 45 on a street where the speed limit is far lower, it kind of has like a knock-on effect. And I think that's low hanging fruit. This is a broader recommendation and probably separate from this bill, but I think maybe just something to float. It also probably could save the district money. But yeah, that was kind of just a little plug I wanted to throw because I noticed that came in late last session.
Yeah, I think for DC fleet, it's probably an easier lift. I think it's kind of probably a third rail right now when it comes to national politics. And so I think that particular component, if it were applied to private vehicles, would probably, my sense is it probably trigger congressional interference. I should also say that Congress has already, some members have hinted at wanting to go at the district's ATE system more generally, which is super problematic for a couple different reasons. But no, I think it makes perfect sense to limit how fast district fleet vehicles can go. I probably wouldn't tie it to the speed limit. I'll say anecdotally, one of the only times I'll exceed the speed limit consciously is when there's a dangerous driver behind me who's clearly flooring it. And so I'll try to moderate my speed in a way that satisfies their needs without them doing something stupid, like trying to, come around, drive around me aggressively or something like that. So it's, yeah, I think we'd probably need to think through how that looks like or what the thresholds would be. But I think for DC fleet, highway or below certainly is still a much more firm limitation than just what your vehicle is capable of doing, which is 90 to 120. So yeah, I think it's a great suggestion. Probably a round two type thing in terms of traffic safety, not this bill, but again, another point well taken.
I appreciate that. And to be clear, I was just talking about the district fleet. But the
Okay,
last
great.
sort of comment I make, which is a round two thing, but I kind of wanted to raise it as well. DeuxMoi is currently putting together their highway safety office is putting together their triennial highway safety plan that they submit to the FHWA. That plan determines how they spend infrastructure funds that are dedicated to driver education. That money, because the infrastructure law was changed to allow them to spend some of those education funds on specifically school zone ATE, and there's a couple of $1 million in there that's actually dedicated toward this. A couple of ANCs have passed resolutions about this, but I think I just wanted to flag that to you. I think some of my colleagues have brought it up to Councilmember Allen, and I brought it up to Councilmember Nadeau and Rick Burt, who runs DeuxMoi's Highway Safety Office. But I think it's sort of a unique opportunity to protect, there's a lot of vulnerable road users, and I think all pedestrians are vulnerable. I think we can all agree that children are probably the most vulnerable to dangerous driving. And I think school zone AT might be able to affect some of those changes. But I just wanted to flag that, because I think spending money on AT, which is a far more effective intervention than, with due respect, Instagram ads that say slow down, or those little signs that say, slow down, that somehow the city put up all around. This is more of just a less of a question, more of a bump that since you were here, I wanted to bring up.
Great, yeah, and if you wouldn't mind sending me one of those resolutions, just so I have kind of the issue in writing, feel free to. I know, I don't know if it intersects with this particular topic, but I know one of the issues we've been having with federal highway funding is that DDOT, as the transportation agency for a territory and not a full-on state, is sometimes not able to apply directly for those grants. I think we've been trying to explore if we can apply for those through MWCOG, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governance, through which we have the Transportation Planning Board, but I don't know if I have a hard answer on that one quite yet.
I'll send you that resolution, but to be clear, this is formula funding that DDOT gets. So
Okay.
the money's coming. Sorry, well, the district government gets the money's coming, but it's sort of this is separate than the STIP. This is the layers of bureaucracy. This is the 3 HSP. I'll send you an email about it. It's more easier written down.
Great, thank you. So that's kind of all I've got on the bill itself. You know, I want to be really clear. A lot of these ideas came from me sitting on these meetings and hearing what you all had to say, as well as the sort of sister councils of the Pedestrian Advisory Council and the Bicyclist Advisory Council. So, well, I wrote it. I think a lot of people sitting in this Zoom call have ownership over a lot of the ideas in it. So thanks so much for getting us up to speed so that we could get this introduced.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks all attendees of this month's meeting of the MAAC for a great conversation. Looking forward to next month's meeting. We're actually having representatives of the ATE task force present, and we'll also continue our conversation about the scorecard that we're putting together. So yeah, thanks all for attending. Kind of I'll just kind of give space. Anyone, any questions, comments, thoughts before we adjourn? Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your August, and we'll see you back here in September.
Thanks all.
Take care, everyone.
you.
Thank you.